Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. Let's take a look at the business cycle diagram, the latest installment of the series I'm putting together called the How to Draw series. Check the link in the description box below to all of the diagrams. The idea is that these are videos dedicated just to how to draw the most important diagrams in your journey through your economics course. All right, let's take a look at the business cycle. All right, well, here's where the story starts. As I say throughout all of this series, related to how to draw diagrams, you gotta figure out where the story begins, okay? So with the business cycle diagram, what you're looking at is this natural fluctuation of an economy over time. So as a result, the business cycle, of course, is going to be related to time. What does that mean? It means like from year to year to year to year. And if you think about pretty much any economy, well-developed, industrialized economy, mature economy, fluctuates on like a 4 to 5 year cycle. A cycle where things are good, then they take a dip, then they're good, then they take a dip, they take a good, right? A little bit of a flow, like a wave, a gentle wave. Okay, so what's happening? Well, what's fluctuating is real GDP. And if you think about, and I don't know if you've covered this yet in your studies, but if you have, go take a look at the how to draw diagram of the neoclassical aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. If you don't know how to draw that diagram, you don't know which one I'm speaking of, take a look at the video right here, okay? That video is going to really help you understand how real GDP, right, changes over time. Because on the horizontal axis of that diagram is real GDP. Real GDP is down here. And as economic growth goes outward, right, that would be an increase in real GDP. But as economic growth goes inward, that would be a decrease in GDP, okay? So if we transfer that idea over to the business cycle, we will see natural fluctuations of GDP going up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay, so hold that idea in your head for a second. Then what's the other idea? Well, you see this blue line I've drawn, and it says long-term growth trend. What does that mean? Well, what that means is from year to year to year to year to year, or decade to decade to decade to decade, like if you think about an industrialized society like the United Kingdom, you know, 1900, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950, blah, blah, right? You hope to see a general upward trend of what? Of real GDP. For what? The economy of a particular country. And I live in Chile, so I put Chile up here. But, you know, this is going to be labeled figure 1, economy of Chile. Real GDP, of course, this is 0. 0 in terms of time, right? And so over time, if a government is doing its job, just like a good parent, there should be a steady growth of the economy. And of course, in industrialized society, what does that mean? It means 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. Because economic growth is one of the economic goals of any economy or any government. What's another one? Low unemployment of 5%, 5%, 5% over the long term. What about inflation? 2%, 2%, 2%. Okay, so on a business cycle diagram, you have something that's the ideal, and that's called the long-term growth trend, or in some books, you'll see this called the potential growth line, which is fine. Potential growth trend, that's fine. Okay, but this would be the ideal. But what actually happens in an economy? Well, it's not exactly ideal, right? The economy starts low, then it goes up high, then it comes down low, then it goes up high, and you see a natural what? Cycle of what? GDP. What kind of GDP? Real GDP over time. So this is basically the diagram. What's it saying? It's saying that when the economy is functioning, if the economy were to function perfectly all the time, it would be like 2% growth, 2% inflation, 5% unemployment, 2% growth, 2% inflation, 5% unemployment, 2% growth, and onward, right? But that's not really what happens. An economy, you know, there's a boom and there's like 4% growth, then there's, you know, 3% unemployment and 4% inflation. and then the government does something to react, and then there's a trough, and you come down here and functioning here, what are you going to have? Well, you're going to have the opposite of that. You're going to have, say, 8% unemployment, 1% growth, and maybe even deflation. Then you come back up here, and this, of course, repeats the same pattern where you have real growth, right? And of maybe 4%, you have unemployment under 5%, you have inflation over 2%. Okay, then it comes back down. But one of the things that's really interesting, and I have a like a needy, like a nice looking diagram on the next page. But if you were to look at this point here, that point there, and that point there, those are the low points of the cycle, right? Here's a low point, there's a low point, and there's a low point. But if you notice, the low point here is still higher than the low point there, and the low point here is still higher than the low point there. So there is this general growth trend. And what governments strive to do, and if you've seen this notion of an output gap, what governments strive to do is actually keep this line as close to the upward to the long-term growth trend as possible, and get rid of what they call output gaps, which are these green areas right here. What does an output gap mean? It's just a gap between the ideal, which would be this blue line, and reality, which is the red line, right? So the government's goal would be to keep this line as flat as possible. So what they want to do is anticipate the highs and anticipate the lows in fiscal policies that will keep this as low as possible, keep this line, this red line, from fluctuating as much as possible. Because long-term growth is better steadily than these massive ups and downs. Okay, so let me clean this up a little bit. Take a look at this next diagram. And you can see that this is exactly the same thing that I just drew. This I've taken actually because I love the way it looks from Jocelyn Blink, and she has an excellent course companion for the IB. But this gives us a little bit more information. Look, we still have real GDP over here. We still have time, right? We're starting at 0, and this time doesn't matter so much. It's just relativeness. And you have a long-term growth trend. That would be the ideal. This would be 2% growth, 2% inflation, 5% unemployment. And then you have reality, right? And there's some key words in here. There's a boom, which is when the economy is doing well, way above the potential growth trend. But that's not good, right? This is like 3% unemployment, 4% growth, 4% inflation. So the government will enact some sort of fiscal or monetary policy, maybe raising interest rates, monetary policy, and it'll drop back down to here. And then all of a sudden the government's like, whoa, wait a second. The economy is slowing down too much. Maybe it's only 1% growth. Maybe they have 8% unemployment, and there's deflationary pressure. So they'll change interest rates again, or maybe some expansionary fiscal policy of like government spending to spend themselves out of this trough. And then they get ahead and they're like, whoa, raise interest rates. Okay. So this general trend, and you'll hear this in the news all the time about, the central banks of whatever countries raising interest rates, lowering interest rates. You might have wondered why they're doing that. They're trying to anticipate a boom, and therefore they would raise interest rates to slow down investment, or they're anticipating a trough, and so they lower interest rates to try to stimulate the economy back up, or maybe the government will, start some sort of government spending program. Okay, so that's the ebb and flow, and everybody knows that this is going to happen. The goal is to keep the distance of these output gaps between the gap is between the real and the potential, the real and the potential, the real and the potential. It doesn't mean bad. A gap usually means bad. I mean, it is bad, but a gap doesn't mean a trough. This is as much of an output gap as this is an output gap. This is too much output that's sustainable. This is not enough, right? The long-term growth trend is what is sustainable. Okay, so we got some right? Some other key words, of course, when the economy is going from the bottom up, it's a recovery. When it's at the top, it's a boom. When it's heading downward, it's a recession. And when it hits the bottom, it's a trough, okay? So we would say that from the boom to the trough, the economy is contracting, which means growth is maybe going from 3% down to 1%, right? Now remember, 1% growth is still better than the year before, but at a slower rate. But still, if you're going from 3% growth to 1% growth, the economy is contracting. And then, of course, the flip side of that is if you're in a trough and you're headed towards a boom, then the economy is expanding, and this would be like 1% growth, right, up to maybe 4% growth again, okay? And that would be studied over time. So that's it. Like, if you need to draw it, like, that is it. And it's pretty simple, but it tells you a whole lot of stories. And this is the whole thing with this series. Like, you have to understand, like, there are an enormous amount of human stories on here. This is not just red and blue lines and recessions and troughs and contractions and expansions. No, these are real people's lives. You know, when it's in a trough, like unemployment's at 8%, that means that a lot of people have lost their jobs. You know, 3% of a workforce could be, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. When you're up here, yeah, it sounds all good and fine, and maybe people are doing well, but the government needs to be responsible for the long run and go like, hey, we cannot grow at a 4% rate. That's bad. We need to cut things back, right? And so these are real people in here, real lives, real output, real children's lives get affected by all of this, okay? So I just want you to know that like this is human behavior, and these are human beings in a country, and like it's ongoing right now wherever it is that you live. And it's just important that you realize that this cycle is constantly in the news because it's talking about growth, unemployment, inflation, you know, recession, boom. It affects the stock market and onward. All right, one last slide I think is really helpful for you to see before we close this up. And that's this one from Ellie Tregeges, who is an IB chief examiner, and she also wrote an excellent textbook. But this is just, it looks a little bit different, but you still got time, you still got real GDP, right? And you have this same ebb and flow. This, of course, here is the long-term growth trend. She also puts it in here as like potential GDP, right? And also this line represents full employment, where there's a natural rate of unemployment. And if you're not into the unemployment concept, right, you know, you're not into that unit, right? Unnatural rate of unemployment just is 5%. Just remember that, 5%, okay? So you want 5% of your society unemployed at any given time. All right, so as you move from A to D, what's happening? Well, there's an expansion and unemployment would fall. This line represents 5% unemployment. So from A to D, there is expansion of the economy. Unemployment's going down to 3%, right? So therefore, actual GDP would be greater than potential GDP. And there's an output gap, as I was saying, right? And unemployment would be less than the natural rate of unemployment. Then there would be contraction, and you get down to B. Now, if the government could stop things, if the government had its way, this would be the growth trend, and everything would be fine. It wouldn't be up and down, up and down. But as we get to B, we come back to a 5% unemployment rate and a GDP growth of about 2%. And then as we go down to E, what happens? Well, actual GDP, which is this green line, or the real GDP, is under the potential GDP, and there's an output gap, meaning that there's a gap here, and unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. What does that mean? About 8%. I always tell my kids, it's like, 8%, just go with that. 3%, 8%, okay? Then when you get back to C, everything's back to where it should be, right? 5% unemployment, 2% growth, 2% inflation. But of course, it pushes past that, and then this whole expansion and contraction cycle would continue, all right? So I just think that's a really helpful thing. Ellie Tregeges put this together. If that kind of overwhelmed you, don't worry about it, okay? It's all right. It's just there's a lot of ideas in there, and maybe as you go through your studies of low unemployment and low and stable rate of inflation and economic growth, this will become more, sort of like more vibrant to you. Or you'll have a deeper understanding of it. But if you can picture just what I drew on the last diagram, that's it. That's how you draw it. It's pretty simple. And all you really need to realize is that there's the real GDP on the vertical, and time over here, the economy, and then a potential growth trend, and then the real GDP over time. Well, there you have it, my friends, the business cycle diagram, a super important diagram in your beginning studies of macroeconomics. I hope you found that video to be helpful. Of course, this is part of the How to Draw series, a series that I'm putting together to help all of you draw the most basic diagrams in IB Economics. There's a link in the description box below that'll take you to the entire playlist. Make sure that you check it out. Also, of course, if you're interested in receiving these videos as I put them out over time and all the videos I post on this channel, be sure to subscribe and click the notifications bell so that you can get notified. All right, I hope you found that helpful. I'm hanging out in the streets of Lo Barnechea, a neighborhood outside of Santiago, Chile, a super vibrant, beautiful place that I call home. I hope you're doing well. Take care, my friends, and we'll talk to you in a bit.